There are just a few things I'd like to note before we get started. The first is that this video is going to have some photographs that have graphic depictions of violence and death in them, which is kind of inevitable, unfortunately, when you talk about World War I. The second is that some of the images that are going to be displayed when I'm reading extracts from the book are AI generated, just to be perfectly clear about that. And the third is that there are a couple of parts that I'm going to be reading in the original French, but the translation that I'm going to present on screen is not a literal translation of the French, it's the literary translation that is in the English version, Poilu. Okay, so with that said, let's head back in time. Stalin once said that a single death is a tragedy, but a million deaths, a statistic. This is, unfortunately, an extraordinarily true statement. All of us can wrap our minds around one death, perhaps as many as 10 deaths, but beyond that, 100 deaths is already more than I'm capable of processing, and as soon as we get into the thousands, the hundreds of thousands, let alone millions, we are into numbers so far beyond what I'm capable of grasping that the scale of death becomes almost meaningless to me. I mean, if we were capable of empathizing with 10,000 deaths, wouldn't we just die from the grief? So perhaps it couldn't be any other way. Thus, how to go about understanding a conflict like World War I then, where 20,000 casualties could be spent in a single day, in a single battle? I mean, the D-Day landings took a week to reach that number, and yet that was a single day on the Battle of the Somme. How do we make sense of that? Reading the large-scale macro histories of the war are important to understand its direction, how the battles played out, what happened to these huge amounts of people over extended periods of time. But personally, I have always been more moved by and more fascinated by the intimate, micro-level stories, those first-hand accounts written by people that experienced the war themselves. It's important to note that these books don't necessarily give you a balanced or comprehensive understanding of the war, rather they give you a sense of the writer's war, what they experienced, a very small slice of the collective experience that so many endured. The power of those stories that revolve around individuals has often been greater than those of the grand, large-scale histories. For example, there have been some great movies made about World War I, and they've almost always been telling the story of the war from the perspective of individuals, such as the 3 adaptations of Heinrich Maria Remarque's generational novel All Quiet on the Western Front, which literally translates from the German as Nothing New on the Western Front, which I always thought summed up the essence of the story a little bit better. But it still stands out as one of the most horrifying and brutally tragic tales of just how pointless and arbitrary so much of the violence was. And we have the work of the master himself, Mr. Stanley Kubrick, and his extraordinary 1957 film Paths of Glory that starred the legend Kirk Douglas and the great Ralph Meeker. And like All Quiet on the Western Front, this was also based on a book. In this case, it was based on Humphrey Cobb's novel of the same name. Sam Mendes has also told his visually striking story with 1917, which was in this case based on an old family tale. But in all these cases, the movies are telling compelling, moving stories about World War I through the eyes of specific people. And when it comes to the books, to these stories, to the accounts that give insight into just what it was to live this war, and perhaps even into the minds of the people that lived it, for me, there is one writer and one book that sits atop all the others. Louis Barthas was a tonnelier, or a cooper, a barrel maker, from the small village of Périac-Minevoire in Aude, which is in the south of France. He had the extremely rare distinction to have been an infantryman at the outbreak of World War I in the French army, served all the way through, and survived. His distinction is compounded by the fact that he kept diaries and notebooks all the way through, and he spent time after the war to organize them thoroughly before he passed away in 1952. And to top off this feat, he happened to have been an extraordinarily funny and witty writer to boot. Les Carnets de guerre de Louis Barthas were discovered or brought to the attention of Professeur Rémi Casal in the 1970s and were originally published in 1978. They were translated into English by Edward Strauss, and I have to say it really is a beautiful translation. It's not a literal translation, it's a literary one, it's a beautiful one, and Edward really captures the music and the poetry of Barthas, and this version was published as Poilu in 2014. Poilu is the colloquial term for a French infantryman, and it literally means hairy one, or like hairy person, due to their outstanding moustaches and their generally unshaven or unkempt appearance. But it's more endearing than that, and it has a feel more akin to Tommy or Fritz. And when one begins to peer into the mind of a Poilu, at the height of the turmoil on the Western Front, we really begin to understand that there was a lot more to this war. And fortunately for us, the mind of Louis Barthas was sharp and penetrating, and his wit was much the same. Now, in 1914, when the war broke out, he was almost 35 years old, which, incidentally, is exactly the same age as I am at the time of making this video, which is terrifying. And whereas many of the young men enlisting were literally in their late teens, maybe early 20s, they were ecstatic about the glory that awaited them and anxious to get their share of it before the war was over. Barthas was under no illusions about what lay ahead. And what lay ahead was horror. And while Barthas was either indirectly or directly involved with the battles of Verdun, the Somme, the Nivelle offensive, in particular the Chemin des Dames, it isn't his involvement in these great battles that make the book so compelling. Rather, it's the small anecdotes, the piercing analyses, the brutal put-downs, the pensive reflections. These are what make the book compelling, how he understood and saw what was happening. Barthas saw the war predominantly through a class lens, rather than a nationalistic one. He did not see the war as being these good, moral Frenchmen set against the evil Germans. Rather, he saw young, working-class men being compelled to kill each other by older, well-to-do, upper-class men. And as such, both him and his comrades ended up feeling more hatred and disgust, and I do use those words advisedly, towards their French commandant, and more fraternité and solidarité with the German infantry, many of whom had similar leanings. But there is a central theme that does run through the entirety of this book. This gaping, glaring disconnect between those who fought on the front, who follow the orders, and those at the rear that give them. Now, I'm not a military analyst, so this is not particularly deep analysis, but if you look at an army on paper, it seems to be a quite straightforward structure. There's a clearly defined hierarchy. Orders are given by those higher up to those lower down, and they are to be followed and implemented without question, and this system is enforced with rigorous discipline. However, unfortunately for the higher-ups in this war, they were commanding human beings and not robots. Barthas records an anecdote from the section in Poilu from May 19 to July 12, 1916, that really depicts this disconnect in real time. You have to picture his regiment as being completely and totally exhausted, being perpetually hungry, persistently sodden for weeks, sometimes months, and they had finally been granted a reprieve to take some time off as they arrived in Betancourt, when the dreaded Commandant Leblanc decided to inspect them, and the reality of this war was brought to the attention of the Commandant and his second by a lowly Poilu. And during this inspection, he spotted among the soldiers a Poilu in shirt sleeves, who seemed to pay no attention to the presence of these two eminent personages, and who was in the process of shaving before a basin of water. Offended by this disrespectful attitude, the Commandant sharply reprimanded this undisciplined fellow. He'd be sorry that he did so. The soldier was a hothead in normal circumstances, and a sorehead when he was a little out of sorts, as was the case today. Insolently looking the Commandant up and down from head to toe, he lashed him with a stream of scornful phrases.
Petit homme, petite grogny. C'est l'hôte en premier l'ange qu'il fallait venir nous voir. Et le premier jour qu'on est à repos, En dimanche, tu viens de m'embêter? À la côte 304, tu n'en sais pas seulement sortir de ton trou. Sors-toi de devant mes yeux.
The commandant was as stunned as if a 250 caliber howitzer shell had landed at his feet. The Capitaine Adjutant-Major staggered back, clutching at the spectacles which he could barely hold onto his nose. Both raging with anger, they departed, no doubt wondering if this unprecedented act wasn't one of the signs of the end of the world, which the Holy Scriptures describe so vividly in terms of abomination and desolation. This was not an isolated incident, and the disgust and hatred that the Poilu had for their commanders only continued to grow. Fundamentally, the issue the officer classes had was that they were commanding an army of human beings. And this is the aspect of the story that Barthas perceives and draws on to such an extraordinary extent, and why his writing is so moving. We are all familiar with the beautiful, powerful, soul-crushing stories of the Christmas truce in 1914, and we're familiar with the furious reaction from the commanders of the French army, British army, and their horror at the prospect of their soldiers, even in one of the worst places to have ever existed on planet Earth, behaving like human beings, and how important it was that this was stamped out. Now, while the Christmas truce is the best known example, or I should say the Christmas truces are the best known examples, there are scores of others from throughout the war, and the one that Barthas recounts is such an example, and he describes it in the most powerful, piercing, and tragically beautiful way. To set the scene, Barthas and his comrades were occupying a trench in the Artois region. It had been raining for days, but it's important to remember that even at this point, to set your head even an inch above the trench was to invite fire from the enemy. But alas, in this period, the situation of the frontline troops was truly lamentable. In certain places, the trenches had completely disappeared underwater. Almost all the dugouts had collapsed. Our section was lucky enough to have a dugout which was still intact, and where, when our work was done, we could stretch out on the cold, damp ground. But one night, when the rain came down in torrents, the tide invaded our dugout and cascaded down both sets of steps. At the height of the storm, some of the men had to devote all of their efforts to building a dam, which the water then broke through at 3 or 4 places. We spent the rest of the night battling the floodwaters. The next day, on December 10th, at many places along the front line, the soldiers had to come out of their trenches so as not to drown. The Germans had to do the same. We therefore had the singular spectacle of 2 enemy armies facing each other without firing a shot. Our common sufferings brought our hearts together, melted the hatreds, nurtured the sympathy between strangers and adversaries. Those who deny it are ignoring human psychology. Frenchmen and Germans looked at each other and saw that they were all men, no different from one another. They smiled, exchanged comments. Hands reached out and grasped. We shared tobacco, a canteen of jus, or pinard. If only we spoke the same language. One day, a huge devil of a German stood up on a mound and gave a speech, which only the Germans could understand word for word, but everyone knew what it meant because he smashed his rifle on a tree stump, breaking it into 2 pieces in a gesture of anger. Applause broke out on both sides, and the Internationale was sung. Well, if only you had been there, mad kings, bloody generals, fanatical hardline ministers, jingoistic journalists, rear echelon patriots, to contemplate this sublime spectacle. Meanwhile, our big-shot leaders were in a furor. What in the Lord's name would happen if the soldiers refused to kill each other? Our artillerymen received orders to fire on any assemblies of men which were pointed out to them, and to mow down indiscriminately both Frenchmen and Germans.
Qui sait, peut-être un jour, sur ces coins de l'Artois, on élèvera un monument pour commémorer cet élan de fraternité entre des hommes qui avaient l'horreur de la guerre et quand obligés s'entretuèrent malgré leur volonté.
And you may be delighted to learn or know that un jour dans ce coin de l'Artois, or one day in this corner of the Artois, was in fact December 17, 2015. 100 years after this extraordinary moment that was recorded so powerfully by Louis Barthas, the Monument de Fraternisation was erected to celebrate this surge in brotherly feeling between men that were forced to kill each other against their will. And ultimately, the fact that this memorial exists at all does represent why this book is so important to me and to so many other people, and why we've been so moved by it. For a tonnelier, a barrel maker from a small village in the south of France, to have had an impact like this, to have moved people in the way that he has. He didn't come from a big, wealthy French family. He wasn't a general, whose memoir was guaranteed to get wide circulation. He was a working class barrel maker, and it was the power of what he wrote that gained him notoriety posthumously all these years later. And for somebody like this to have even been able to write these notes, let alone actually spend the time to do so throughout the entirety of the war, it's a miracle of history, so far as I'm concerned. I just imagine him being, in a damp dugout, cold, hungry, sodden, but still writing. And this book, it really is a miraculous gift, and I just encourage everybody to spend some time rifling through the pages and reading it. And as well as books, there is one resource that I have to mention, and it was the first place I ended up when I decided that I wanted to start learning about World War I, and that is Dan Carlin's seminal podcast series, A Blueprint for Armageddon, which is part of his Hardcore History series. And their enthusiasm and passion for what they write about and talk about is so overwhelming and infectious that you cannot help becoming passionate and interested in what it is they're talking about. But with that, I want to thank you very, very much for watching this video, for joining me in commemorating this wonderful book, and for remembering this remarkable person. And I hope that we will see you next time. Thank you again. Bye-bye.